Recording. Hello, my name's Robert Rickover, and my guest today is Tim Cacciatore. He is a PhD in neuroscience, and he's also an Alexander Technique teacher living in London, I believe, right? London, England?
The West Country of
The
England, the
West
West.
Country, right? And he is an expert in the neuroscience of postural tone and its relationship with movement coordination. He was motivated to study postural control because of the lack of a plausible explanation for how the Alexander technique affected posture and helped his own back pain. And his research is aimed to use somatic methods as a tool to reveal properties of the motor system, and he's published numerous peer-reviewed articles. And the reason I wanted to talk to Tim is I've been experimenting a lot with what I guess one could call the interface between thought and action.
Mhm.
And I've been experimenting with Alexander technique directions that to me seem to be directed at that interface. And I'm inspired a lot by a quote from actually F. Matthias Alexander, the developer of the Alexander technique, who wrote this. I'll just read this short little paragraph in Constructive Conscious Control, but I think he also talked about it in Man's Supreme Inheritance and as well. And he says, the term psychophysical is used both here, and that's in his book, Constructive Conscious Control, and throughout my works to indicate the impossibility of separating physical and mental operations in our conception of the working of the human organism. And then he says, in my opinion, the two must be considered entirely interdependent. And this is the phrase I really love, and even more closely knit than is implied by such a phrase. And it's that closely knitness that is what I'm personally interested in. And the reason I wanted to talk to Tim is, I said, I've been working on new Alexander directions that very much relate to that. And I wanted to find out from him if what I think is the explanation of why these directions work so well is plausible from a neuroscience point of view. That's the basic project.
Okay.
So I want to begin with what are sometimes called paradoxical Alexander technique directions. I think they were first kind of brought to the fore by Missy Vinyard in her introductory book. It's kind of in there as like a little separate section from sort of the general introduction to the technique. But a paradoxical directions are of the kind where whatever activity you're doing, the direction would be, I'm not doing that activity. So if I'm walking, I could think, I'm not walking. And amazingly enough, that always seems to produce an improvement in the quality of walking. And the question kind of is, well, why would that be? It sounds like an odd direction to try to improve things. Now, my take on it is when you say something like, I'm not walking, you're really referring to walking as you experience and understand it. but there's all kinds of other kinds of walking. You could, if you're out on the street and you see a lot of people walking, they're all walking, but they're all pretty much walking a little differently. And so when you think to yourself as you walk, I'm not walking, to me, that's your conscious brain, the part of your brain that's above your eyes, basically, that says, is basically saying, find another way of walking that's different from my habitual one.
Mhm.
And it's saying that, and this is my take on it, it's saying that or thinking that as a message to the unconscious brain, which is most of your nervous system, and it's saying, you guys figure out another way of walking for me. Now, it might seem at first glance as though your unconscious mind, it would be like a 50-50 chance that your walking would improve. It might get worse if on the surface, but oddly enough, that isn't what happens. In my experience, and I think other people who've used these kind of directions and lots of students, it always seems to bring about an improvement. Now, that's an interesting phenomenon in itself.
Yeah.
And does just that part, what's your take on that from a neuroscience perspective?
Sure, sure. Well, I guess let's just begin just with some groundwork, right? So
Sure.
I too have experienced that phenomena myself. Doesn't
Right.
always work for me, but sometimes it has for sure. Uh, um, but we have to. No one's studied that, right? So we have to take that assumption for granted, basically, and go from there. So presuming that that is an improvement, and I've had experiences, you've had experiences, it's reasonable that it is. What could explain that? Um, yeah, I think there's many things. I mean, if you think of the motor system, it's kind of arranged hierarchically, right? There's many different levels to the motor system.
Mhm.
Uh, um, and there's the basic walking rhythm is produced by neurons within the spinal cord, right? Very, very low, right? You can take people who have had a spinal cord injury, right? And there's no communication from the higher brain, and you can basically put a battery near their spinal cord, no kind of rhythmic information whatsoever, and their legs will start, walking.
Uh-huh.
Is it normal gait? No, but but uh, um, but that represents the output of a very low level aspect of of the nervous system. So why would you have that? Well, we've evolved over a long period, and basic tasks like gait, like walking, are difficult. Like if you think about the numbers of muscles involved, right, and the stability involved. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, there's a lot to it, and there's no way that you could consciously think about those motor
Right.
patterns. Those motor
Right.
patterns are kind of built in at a very low level. Um, on top of that, there are neurons in the brainstem that regulate those and tune them, and these pattern generating neurons are flexible. They don't just generate one rhythm. You have to be able to walk backwards,
Mhm.
walk forwards, kick, right? It uses some of the same circuitry. So the circuitry is sort of flexible. Uh, um, but it's also kind of regulated by brainstem circuitry, which is in turn, well, and then there are sort of higher levels, right? So if you're, I
Higher
mean,
levels within the unconscious brain, unconscious nervous system.
yeah, well, right,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
oh, yes. So if you take you can have an animal that where the cortex is completely disconnected or shut down, uh,
Hmm.
um, and they can stand and they can walk using this sort of brainstem and spinal cord circuitry, and it's functional. It's not what you'd call agile,
Hmm.
but it's a functional pattern. Uh, um, but then, so say you're walking along and there's a curb to step down
Hmm.
over.
Hmm.
Well, that involves a whole nother loop of higher level aspects to the motor hierarchy, right? Where you see you see the curb, you know how far it is, you kind of know where your body is in space, and you plan what would be called the sort of voluntary movement, even if it's subconscious.
Hmm.
It's sort of this goal-directed kind of flexible movement that can step over the curb or the log or
Right,
whatever in your way. So it's another layer of control on top.
right. So the way I went, I have sort of a penchant for wanting to explain to my students why, when they think something like I'm not walking, it seems to always produce mostly a positive effect. And the way I tend to phrase it is, first of all, this prefrontal cortex guy who's delivering the message is totally incapable of changing your walking in any useful way. Because it's limited in how many. This is my explanation. I want to check this out with you, but it's limited because it can only attend to a fairly small number of ideas or thoughts or attentions, um, at any one time. And to change your walking gait, as you say, that's going to be certainly the lower level stuff, but also a lot of higher level, but all within the unconscious brain. That
Mm,
your unconscious brain, if the way I think of it is, if you ask your unconscious brain to find a new way of moving, your unconscious brain is very happy to do that, and it springs into action to do that without any interference on my part, as long as I stay out of my conscious brain stays out of the way, which of course is a whole nother issue in directing. But that it not only can arrange all the changes that are needed, but it has, as you said, its own higher level functioning. And part of that says, well, he's asking for a different kind. I could give him a worse kind, but that's just not what I'm about. I'm here to help in some sense. So I have a bias towards improvement, not towards making things worse. But that is a higher level function that would have that kind of duality, right? Does that make sense to you, that basically your conscious brain, which is a very small part of your brain, really,
mm.
it's great at coming up with plans and projects and all the rest, but it's the last person in the world. It's the world's worst micromanager.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
not good at it, but it's
yeah.
great at putting out messages, and it can learn. And this is can be tricky for new students. It can learn to put out messages and stay out of the way of what happens. And does that fit in with what we know from neuroscience, or is that something that?
Uh, yeah. Let me speak to that. I mean, the first thing I was gonna say when you said that uh the higher level cortex or prefrontal
Yeah.
cortex or whatnot isn't good at um I forget controlling
taking care of all the details, of which
Right,
there are a
right.
huge number.
That was, yeah. So that was the point I was going to emphasize. It's very good at like selecting task goals or strategies
Mhm,
or this,
mhm,
that, and the
mhm.
other.
Yeah,
I think you said it. The right word
yeah,
is micromanaging, and that's what it's not. That's what it's not good at. That's why there are these sort of low level circuits, right?
right,
That take care of that. Now, I guess, really so the simple model of the phenomenon that you're explaining is that that somewhere in the higher levels are getting involved, and they're getting involved in a way that is counterproductive, right? That's causing patterns of holding or
right,
whatnot. Uh,
right,
and that's somehow associated with the idea of doing the activity.
right,
Um, so I mean that may be true. There could be lots of reasons for the difficulties, right? So what makes up bad use, right? And where is the issue? And it could be higher level stuff that's superimposed into these patterns of holding
right.
that are not, as opposed to the more normal postural tone related circuitry that does that, for instance,
Mhm.
right? And so if you have a high level managing a low level and doing it badly, it makes sense to get rid of the high level, right?
Right. And that problem in self-directing of you put out a direction, something seems to improve, and then there's a part of you that starts to anticipate that improvement or
Right.
want to help it a little.
Yes.
That
Yes.
issue is
Yeah.
what Alexander explicitly addressed in a quote
Yeah.
from his training course, where he says, none of my students will believe that all they have to do is, I'm paraphrasing, but all they have to do is think the thought, and that'll take care of it. They
Yeah.
all want to add something, and pretty much every teacher, Walter Carrington, certainly, and Marjorie Bar Barlow, and both of them, and Marjorie Barstow in her own way, all discuss this very issue.
Mhm.
Marjorie Barlow says, well, you put out a direction, and then you think, a little teeny bit I could help. And that's just not going to work. That's going to
Yeah.
mitigate against the effectiveness. And Walter's take was something along the lines of, you just don't quite believe that you don't need to do
Yeah.
anything because we're all doers. Actually,
Yeah.
Alexander said in that first quote of his, he added,
Mhm.
these my students, they're all slaves to their muscles, which is an
Sure.
interesting way of putting it. So, I
Yeah.
mean, that problem of the conscious brain wanting to take on some of the doing. Oh, and of course, what's her name? Margaret Goldie was like totally
Yeah.
about that. Is something that you have to learn to deal with. You have to learn how to do that, and that's what
Yeah.
hopefully
Sure.
a good teacher will convey
Sure.
to their students. So, if the other thing I want to say, and tell me what you think about this. There's so much going on at the unconscious mind at various levels, and it is making decisions. It's whether to make your walking easier or not, whatever. But all of that, by definition, is out of your conscious. You don't see any of that. And I think the problem for a lot of people is that they don't really, maybe it's not a problem, but people don't really realize how much stuff is going on. They don't give it credit. They don't get that really
Yeah.
putting out a direction can be a pretty simple thing to do. And then, but the implementation is just multifaceted across all kinds of layers because everything in the body affects everything else. So it's, and it can't, it's not going to make you a perfect walker to say I'm not walking because your physical mechanism might not be ready for that yet, but it's going to nudge, it's going to get you as far as can be done right now. That's also a kind of it's doing some thinking about it, apart from just taking care of this little muscle contract a little bit here, this whatever. And again, does that sort of match how neuroscience looks at the unconscious brain versus the conscious brain?
I mean, yeah, there certainly is an immense amount going on under the hood all the time that we're not aware of. However, there is a question of, I mean, people can learn to control very focused, specific, low level aspects of their
Mhm.
physiology, their heart rate or skin temperature, whatever. People can, it is possible in some instances to tune into those lower levels and kind of
Mhm.
fiddle with them. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, so it's not, and certainly when you can attune right through attention and awareness to information coming in that you might not usually be aware of.
Mhm. You can
So
sort
so
of wake
because you
yourself up to
just
stuff
because you're
that might,
yeah
yeah,
just because you're typically not aware of it doesn't mean you can't be. But then there's the question of well, what is sort of optimal? What 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 is sort of the optimal state, and how do you achieve that? Is it being aware of everything all the time? Probably not, right? There's
right,
probably
right,
there's
yeah,
probably certain you never get anything done.
right.
There are probably certain aspects of awareness that are important, that are related to the patterns of tension that we hold, and habits that we want to that we want to get rid of. Um, yeah. So eh, that it does fit, but the devil is in the details.
Right.
Uh,
But do you think I'm making a mistake by kind of presenting this simplified model to my students?
no. If it works, no, I don't. And I mean, it's undoubtedly there is a very close connection between intention and action.
Right.
And there's something called the idiomotor effect, and we can talk about its relevance. But if you take a pendulum, a weight with or a string with a little weight on the bottom, and you say, okay, I'm not going to move my hand, I'm not doing anything, but okay, let's see if I can make it go forward and backward without doing anything. It'll start, and then
Because
okay,
you
let's
are doing a little something probably, or your
well,
unconscious brain.
right,
Yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
but so if they look at it, it's like, a lot of it comes from the postural sway at the feet, and some comes from the shoulder. It's not just like you're doing this, but there's
Right.
kind of a whole body
Right.
organization that kind of makes that happen, and you're unaware of it.
Right.
You're
Right.
unaware that you're doing anything. So I mean, it's kind of like a Ouija board thing, with a bunch of people,
Right.
uh,
Right.
pe pe
But it's
people.
for real as opposed to the,
Right.
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But so when one can, I mean, the real question, I mean, is so at what level are we interfacing with these kind of lower levels? Yeah, I mean, it could be gait, but for me, my lower level of choice is tone. I really am interested in the patterns of tension, but gait is it's a similar low
Well,
level
sure. Well, you can even
phenomenon.
use that same kind of direction for something like sitting in a chair. You
Yeah,
could just think, hey, I'm not sitting in this chair. And
sure.
there's a very good chance that your quality of your posture will improve a little if you want.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you about that phrase of Alexander's because to me, he says about physical and mental, they're even more closely knit than is implied by such a phrase.
Mhm.
Now, I think maybe he's in, maybe not consciously, but he's pointing out that the prefrontal cortex is connected directly to the unconscious brain, right? Are there not connections there
Oh yeah,
all over it's
there's
not like the
loads of
prefrontal
stuff. Yeah,
cortex is totally walled off and
yeah, and it's not just so just to be clear, like your intention. I know we think about the prefrontal cortex as being kind of the top of the hierarchy, right? The sort of
right,
executive control function, and
right.
and it is where things like working memory and whatnot, where you wrestle with decisions and that sort of thing. But I mean, a lot of intention is also related to parietal cortex, or the sort of vision, the sort of spatial, the area that kind of, is involved in where the body is in space.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Because I mean, for the simple fact, if you see something, coming towards you and you want to swat it or pick it up or whatever, the first thing you need to do is know where that thing is relative to you.
Hmm.
And so, if you stimulate these parietal areas, uh,
Hmm.
um, people will report their arm moving even though it doesn't.
Right, right.
Uh,
Yeah,
uh, and so they're very closely involved in our intention. So just to
yeah,
substitute, it's not just prefrontal, but it's more of the cortex, but I mean, the same principle applies.
right.
Um,
To me, it seems as though Alexander, writing all those years ago, who he didn't know a whole lot about neuroscience, and there hardly was any neuroscience, right, back then,
yeah,
kind of, with that phrase of his, kind of indicated a deep understanding of what's going on in us.
for
And
sure.
that, the Alexander teachers love to use the phrase non-doing. Um, and it's a tricky phrase because maybe you don't want your prefrontal cortex to do anything other than deliver a message,
Mm.
but there's going to be lots of doing going on.
Yeah,
And
uh,
your job is your conscious job is to
yeah,
stay out of the way of all of that.
yeah.
So that's pretty much what I wanted to ask you about. It just well, let me just throw out a little everyday analogy that I throw
Mhm.
out to people sometimes. Um, so I'll say, well, supposing you decide that you don't want to mow your lawn anymore and you want to hire some guy to come and do it because you want to free up that time to do important things or to rest or whatever. And the guy comes, and every couple of minutes, you go out and take a look at what he's doing and offer suggestions. Or I'd like you to mow in a different pattern or whatever. And I'll say, well, how do you think to them, how do you think that's going to work? And they all say, well, he'll probably quit. And it's not, and you're not even getting the thing you wanted to, one of the things you wanted to get, which is not to have to worry about it, right? And if the guy is terrible, well, then you get another guy. It's not that big a deal. But to me, that seems like an analogy that's very, and you could think of all sorts of variants on it, but that's the kind of analogy that I find students immediately get, and which is to me helpful in the learning process, that they can actually understand, at least to some extent, why the directions they're using are so useful. So I don't know, is there anything else that you would want to say on that connection with
Yeah, yeah,
prefrontal
yeah,
and the rest?
yeah. There's a couple things. I mean, f first off, I very much agree with your description of non-doing in the sense that it's, I mean, obviously, if you're standing up, there's muscle activity happening because otherwise you'd be,
You know,
flat on the floor.
there's gotta be
Right?
some doing.
So,
Yeah,
so there's lots of stuff that has to happen, and I guess the question is, it's sort of at what level, and so if you're making voluntary posture adjustments, you're standing up, trying to stand up tall or whatever. That's a volitional
right,
system that's on top. That's not interfacing with this lower level system.
right,
So the question is, how do we interface with the lower levels if those are the things that we want to influence?
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have the answers to that. I mean, there are lots of possibilities, right? And there's possibilities, ranging from awareness to attention. Those are different things, actually. Attention is sort of more focused, awareness is more broad. But then there's body representations, like paying attention to like the spatial relationship between your right shoulder and your left hip or something like that. That's not sensory information coming in. That's awareness of a representation of where how things are put together.
It's a conscious representation,
Yeah, yes, but it does also act
but it will
unconsciously
affect the
too. But there's
unconscious. Yeah,
right,
right.
that's a whole can of worms in and of itself with a lot of arguments between scientists about it.
Right.
But then on top of that, there's kind of almost a fourth level, right? Which is intention, right?
Mm.
And so intentions seep through to the motor system. I think that's pretty clear. Your
That's kind of
expectations,
what we're talking about.
yeah,
Intention or what you want
yeah,
I want, let's say, I want to move more easily or something like that. But I think it's kind of more effective to think, uh, whatever I'm doing, come up with something else.
yeah,
Let the unconscious brains. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And
That's interesting.
if what you want is, say, less tension, I'd like to be less tense. That could be a reasonable request. That the unconscious brain, in my sense, is that it'll say, well, let's go for the low-hanging fruit. If this guy is tensing his neck like crazy, that might be a great place to do some
Yeah,
affect some changes, but we're going to do it in the context of his whole self.
yeah,
That's what I'm playing with a lot these days.
yeah,
This seems
yeah.
to
I hear
me
you. Mhm.
really interesting, and people, I don't know, I just find that students, for the most part, just because basically you're telling your student that all of these new different ways of being that they would like to have because they're having these problems, they're all there available already. It's not like I'm going to come along and give it to them. They
Mhm.
have it. They just need to activate it, you might say.
Sure.
It's just a
But
question.
there's
Tap
also, I mean,
into
there's
it.
also things that, right? So there's almost two sides to it too, right? I mean, there's activating the desired thing, and then there's also getting rid of things that interfere with that.
Right, right. Yeah,
Uh, uh, um, and yeah, those two things probably have to happen together, tend to influence
right.
each other.
Yeah.
Uh, um, I mean, I've been having some conversations with a colleague recently about this, and you know, the role of so he does some somatic practices that are a little bit different, And um, yeah, I mean, he kind of understands non-doing. There are sort of analogs, but I don't know. He has been arguing for a more that the intention aspect of it is really important.
Yeah, well, that's what I think. I think
And
it's
and it may be, right? It may be. That's one possibility. But
intention,
then there's
intention not on what exactly is going to happen, but just I'd like it to be better. Or well, I just like
okay.
to improve,
Right,
um,
right.
different. Well, really, all you're saying is I want to be doing this activity I'm doing differently, and I have faith that the unconscious brain is not going to sabotage me and make it worse because that's
Yeah,
just my experience. And I don't need my job is once I put that out there to just get totally out of the way and ideally almost be indifferent to what happens.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe if you're performing experiments of using it, and you notice something nice happening, you could just softly think, well, I'll get back to that after the experiment's over. Right now, I just I just want to use this process. And then I can examine what happened later. But if I start examining right away, that's not it's like going out there and harassing the mower, right?
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's getting getting too involved.
Yeah.
But the intention you describe is different from an intention that specifies what is happening, right? So like with the pendulum example, right?
Right.
Your intention is specifying forward, back, forward, back. Okay, maybe you're not aware of it, but it has a direction to it, so to speak. And you could argue that maybe something is analogous to spine lengthening, shoulders widening, back
Sure.
widening, or whatnot, right? Uh,
Right.
uh, but right, so that would be an example of intention sort of creeping in this kind of I don't want to say goal-oriented way, but in specifying the outcome. This is kind of what I would like.
So it could be something like, and this is just be a straight up negative direction. I'm not tensing my neck, or I'm not compressing
Right,
myself.
right,
Those are negative directions. They're not paradoxical. They what
right.
you're saying is pretty clearly what you want,
Yeah,
and you don't know what that's going to be,
right.
but that's you're making a statement about what you want to be different,
Yes,
what you
yes,
want to stop
yes.
doing.
Right.
So anyway,
And I think that's different in a key way, right? In that it's not specifying the what specifically what you want to happen.
well, it's
And
like it's
again,
like John Dewey saying you to tell a guy to stand up straight is about the most useless thing you could tell him because all he's going to do is rearrange his habits in a new way that's just going to be it's going to be different for sure, but it's going to be equally bad to what he was doing before. It's not going to actually make things any better.
sure, sure.
It would be, to me, it would be wonderful if there were some way to do neuroscience type investigations of that with real people thinking that, telling them you know, experimenting with it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's possible, but that would be, to me, seems like a
Yeah. Oh,
fantastic.
there's yeah, sure. People study that sort of thing. I mean, it is really tricky. It's because it's very subtle, but there are ways of getting at that, and I think it's important. Uh, um, I mean, I my own personal experience, even with kind of subtle, um, like if I'm even so slightly too directive about what's going to happen, I
Hmm.
get in trouble, and I have
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
as you're saying, I have to not know what's going to happen because the second it starts specifying something,
yeah.
that's probably, I see that. specifying something, even at a subtle level, I kind of see that as like this ideomotor goal-directed action, right? That
Uh-huh.
is fixing something.
It could be even yesterday I used this direction, let's say when I'm walking around the block around near my house, and now today I'm using it, and part of me might get a little upset if what happens is different from what happened yesterday, and it can be incredibly subtle.
Yeah,
That kind of
yeah,
that's you getting in there into the weeds where you could say you don't belong there. You belong at this somewhat removed part of your brain, not really removed, but has its own function. And if you try to use that to manipulate things, it's just not going to work out.
well, well, I mean, so, yes, I hear you, and I sort of agree with that model actually, but we can micromanage low-level things for a reason. That there are aspects of that that are probably important. It just happens to not work very well with the phenomena that we're talking about. Uh,
Right, right.
uh, but if you need to, yeah, if you need to micromanage, your well, your like just go back to your temperature, or your heart rate, or
Mhm.
whatever. There might be a good reason to use these micro managing things. It's just with use, it doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to work so
And
well.
used just for anyone listening who doesn't know, it's sort of the Alexander jargon for how you're using yourself, broadly speaking, I guess you could say. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would add to this? Yeah.
No,
Well,
I don't think so, except for it is, I mean, I look forward to the future science that that can, unravel this a bit more, a little and a little bit more
it
definitive.
would be nice. Yeah.
And we can sketch out the problem enough to kind of talk about it and have some models. But it's possible that someone came with a different experience, and we could come up with a different model, right? And we just don't
Yeah.
have the data to be able to. But I really look forward to, when we can, understand, more what's happening, when things are going well, from our perspective.
The late Marjorie Barstow used to say occasionally that she was not, um, knew nothing of neuroscience or anything like that. But she said, I think someday there's going to be an actual science of movement, meaning kind of science of explaining of how the Alexander technique or that way of thinking works. And she would have been absolutely fascinated to see that machinery you use for measuring postural tone. I mean, it would have just been, she would have been blown away by it. Because that's exactly what she predicted, the kind of thing she predicted,
Sure.
that you could actually measure it, and
Mhm.
anyway, well, maybe we should end the conversation here, if that's okay. My guest has been Tim Cacciatore, an Alexander Technique teacher and a neuroscientist living in England. Anyone who's watching this who wants to learn more about his work uh, should go to was it Alexander and Science site. I'll put the
Uh,
link.
AlexanderTechniqueScience.com.
Alexander Technique Science. I'll put a link to that by the interview. And he, along with what's his name? I can't think of it now. Your friend in Amsterdam,
Patrick and
Patrick.
also Rizal
Patrick,
Cohen
yeah.
together.
They run courses that you can take to explore some of that the scientific, you might say, aspects of the Alexander technique. So on that page, you can learn how to sign up for them. Whatever. Tim, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me, Robert.